It was a routine flight, one of those countless journeys people take across the country with passengers settled into their seats, fastened their seatbelts, and mentally prepared for the hours ahead. In one of the rows near the middle of the plane, a man sat quietly by the window. He was dressed casually in a simple t-shirt and jeans, but there was something about his presence that seemed unremarkable yet oddly intriguing. He had a calm aura around him, focused on his own thoughts as the flight was just beginning. Beside him, a middle-aged woman had already settled in, adjusting her seat and preparing for the long journey. She appeared to be in her late 40s with short blonde hair and an air of someone who expected the world to accommodate her. She wasn't someone who'd hesitate to share her opinions, even if they weren't always wanted. She glanced at the man beside her, offering a polite smile, but it didn't take long for her to begin scrutinizing him. At first, it seemed innocent enough, a glance at his clothes, a brief look at his posture, which, admittedly, wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but the way she eyed him suggested something more, something critical. She muttered a few words under her breath, then turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't think I've ever seen someone so underdressed for a flight like this," she remarked, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. The man, not wanting any confrontation, simply nodded politely, trying to ignore her as he adjusted his headphones. He was used to people judging him based on appearances, and he didn't have the energy to engage in an argument. After all, he was just a passenger like everyone else, and he just wanted to get through the flight. But the woman wasn't done. She leaned in a little closer, still watching him with a critical eye. "You know," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "people who look like you usually don't belong in this section of the plane. I can't imagine how someone like you could afford a seat up here." The word stung, but the man remained calm. He didn't want to cause a scene, so he gave a soft, non-committal reply. "I'm just here for the flight, just like everyone else." The woman didn't seem satisfied with his answer. She raised an eyebrow, her expression now clearly showing disdain. "Well, I'm sure you got on the plane by some mistake," she continued, her voice louder now. "I've seen people like you in economy class, not in business, but I suppose it's nice that you're getting a chance to be where you don't belong for once." Her words grew bolder, and now it was clear to the passengers around them that something was going on. The man glanced around, but no one seemed to be paying attention to the exchange. Still, the discomfort in his chest grew with every word she spoke. He knew he had to keep his cool. After all, getting into a fight wouldn't help anything, but the woman wasn't finished. "Honestly, I bet you're just here because you got lucky," she added, her voice laced with judgment. "Someone probably gave you this ticket as some sort of charity." She looked at him with an almost cruel satisfaction, as if she had won some silent victory by degrading him. The man felt the eyes of the people around him, sensing that the mood in the cabin had shifted. Some passengers were beginning to notice the interaction, though most kept their heads down, hoping not to get involved. He wanted to shut her down, to tell her that her assumptions were wrong, but something in him told him it wasn't worth it. Instead, he simply stared straight ahead, gripping the armrest as the flight attendant passed by, unaware of the exchange. He could feel his anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he refused to let it show. The woman, however, was not going to stop. "You know," she continued, "people like you." She stopped, her eyes scanning him. "You're the type of person who always thinks they deserve more than they actually do. You probably don't even know how to behave in places like this." Her words were sharp, biting. The passengers around them grew more uncomfortable, some shifting in their seats, but none dared to speak up. It wasn't easy to stand up to someone like her, especially when she was so blatant in her cruelty. The man remained quiet, forcing himself to stay composed. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation, but it was becoming harder to ignore her insults. "You know," she said, leaning in even closer, her voice a little louder, "I bet you've never even been to a place like this. You probably have no idea what it means to truly succeed." At this point, a few heads turned, people starting to take notice. Some passengers could feel the awkwardness in the air, but no one spoke up. The man could feel the tension building, the weight of her words sitting heavily in his chest. He tried to steady his breathing, thinking about the many ways he could respond. But none of them felt like they would end the situation peacefully. He knew that if he said anything, it would only make things worse. But then, just as the woman was about to continue her tirade, the flight attendants appeared at the front of the cabin. They were moving down the aisles, checking in on passengers and asking if anyone needed anything. It was a brief distraction, but it gave the man the chance to take a deep breath, to refocus, and try to ignore the woman beside him. However, the woman wasn't done. As the attendants walked by, she loudly muttered, "This plane is full of people who don't belong here, and it's just pathetic." She spoke as though everyone around her should agree, as though her opinion was law. It didn't take long for the attendants to notice the tension between the two. One of the attendants stopped near the woman's row, giving her a polite but firm look. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked, her tone professional. The woman flashed a bright fake smile. "Oh yes, everything's fine," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I'm just trying to deal with a person who clearly doesn't know how to behave." The attendant raised an eyebrow, looking between the woman and the man. It was clear she could sense something wasn't quite right, but she wasn't yet sure what had transpired. The man didn't say anything, but his body language made it clear he was trying to ignore the situation. The flight attendant smiled politely but didn't walk away. "Ma'am, if there is an issue, we'd be happy to assist. We want all of our passengers to be comfortable." The woman's face hardened. She hadn't expected to be called out by the flight crew. "Oh, I'm sure," she snapped, her voice growing more agitated. "But it's not like you can do anything about it, can you? Some people just don't belong here, and no amount of help will change that." There was a brief moment of silence as the flight attendant's expression grew more serious. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to calm down. If you continue this behavior, we'll have to take further action." The woman's attitude shifted. For a brief moment, she looked almost surprised by the firm response, but her eyes narrowed, clearly annoyed. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, but she didn't quiet down entirely. Her voice still carried a sharp edge, though she'd backed off for the moment. The tension in the air was undeniable. As the woman fell silent, the man glanced around at the other passengers. Some seemed to be looking at him with sympathy, while others avoided eye contact. It was clear that what had started as a small verbal jab had now escalated into something that couldn't be ignored. For the rest of the flight, the woman kept her distance, her words turning quieter, but the discomfort in the air remained. The man stared out of the window, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this kind of encounter, but now he had to decide how to deal with what was coming next. As the plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, the tension between the man and the woman remained thick in the air. For a while, the woman fell quiet, seemingly satisfied that she had made her point. But the man could feel the weight of her words still lingering. He had hoped the encounter would end there, but it didn't take long for her to start up again, her voice growing louder this time. "I just don't get it," she muttered under her breath, still sitting close enough to him for him to hear. "People like you, they always think they can just fit in wherever they want. It's like they don't even know their place." The man tightened his grip on the armrest, trying his best to keep his temper in check. He had been through moments like this before, when people tried to undermine him, when they made assumptions about him based on nothing more than his appearance. But this time was different. This wasn't just a casual comment. It was personal. It stung in a way he hadn't expected. He looked out of the window, hoping the view of the endless sky would give him some sense of peace. But the woman didn't give him that space. She was relentless, leaning in even closer now. "You know," she continued, her tone dripping with contempt, "I've been on a lot of flights, and I've never seen someone like you in a place like this. You're just out of place, that's all there is to it. I can't imagine how you even managed to get this ticket. People like you don't deserve things like this." The man's jaw tightened. He knew he had to say something, or the situation would spiral further. But as he opened his mouth, the woman's words cut through again, louder this time. "It's people like you who make everything so much harder for everyone else," she went on, not caring if anyone else was listening. "You come into spaces where you don't belong and you expect people to just accept it. Well, let me tell you, I'm not accepting it." This time the man turned to face her, trying to keep his voice steady. "What exactly do you mean by that?" he asked, though his question didn't come from a place of wanting to engage. He was simply trying to get her to explain herself, hoping she would realize how far she had crossed the line. The woman didn't back down. Instead, she leaned in even closer, her eyes narrowing. "I mean," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper, "people like you don't understand the value of things. You think you can just waltz into a place like this without earning it. It's people like you who make things more difficult for the rest of us." Her words were like daggers, each one aimed at his self-worth. The man felt his heart race, the urge to snap back at her rising. But he forced himself to take a deep breath to keep his composure. He wasn't going to let her provoke him into a response that would only make the situation worse. Around them, other passengers started to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some glanced over, their eyes wide with disbelief at what was happening. Others, too afraid to speak up, kept their heads down, trying to ignore the exchange. The flight attendants had walked by again, but they hadn't intervened yet. It seemed like no one knew how to handle this situation, and the man knew it was only going to escalate if someone didn't step in soon. But the woman wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She was on a roll now, her voice growing more and more aggressive. "You don't belong here, you know," she continued, her eyes flashing with hostility. "You're just taking up space that other people deserve more than you. And you don't even seem to care." The man clenched his fists, but he refused to let her get the best of him. He had faced worse in his life. Racism, discrimination, people who judged him before they even knew his name. But this time it felt different. He had to hold on to his dignity, not for her but for himself. "I don't need your approval," he said quietly, still trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm just here for the flight, just like you. I didn't ask for your judgment and I don't need it." But the woman just laughed, a sharp mocking sound that made him feel small. "Oh, I'm sure you didn't," she said, her voice oozing sarcasm. "But here you are, acting like you belong in a place you've never earned. It's pathetic, really." She wasn't just attacking him anymore. She was attacking everything about him, his worth, his value, his very presence. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of anger, but he refused to let it control him. He wasn't going to let her drag him into her world of petty judgment. As she continued her tirade, the atmosphere on the plane grew increasingly uncomfortable. The woman's words were now echoing throughout the cabin, her voice loud enough for the passengers around them to hear clearly. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. A few passengers had even started to look at the man with sympathy, but no one spoke up. No one dared to stand up to the woman. Then, as if sensing the growing unease in the cabin, one of the flight attendants appeared near their row. She had been watching from a distance, and now she approached with a calm, professional demeanor. The woman was momentarily distracted, her eyes shifting toward the attendant. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her voice steady. "Is everything okay here?" The woman quickly put on a smile, but it was clear she was far from being sorry. "Oh, everything's just fine," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm just dealing with someone who doesn't know how to behave." The attendant raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. She looked at the man, who simply nodded, confirming that the woman's behavior was the issue. The tension in the air was thick now, and it was obvious that something needed to be done before it got any worse. "I'm going to ask you to remain calm, ma'am," the attendant said firmly. "If this continues, we may have to take further action." The woman's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing with annoyance. "Fine," she muttered. "But you can't stop me from speaking the truth." The flight attendant didn't respond, but she didn't walk away either. She lingered nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the situation. The woman, seemingly satisfied that she had made her point, leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms defiantly. The man, still holding on to his composure, turned his attention back to the window. The rest of the flight passed in a tense silence. The woman remained quiet, but it was clear from her body language that she wasn't finished. The man kept his focus, but the words she had thrown at him kept replaying in his mind. It wasn't just the insults, it was the way she had made him feel. As if he didn't deserve to be where he was, as if his very existence in that space was a mistake. The rest of the flight was uneventful, though the uneasy energy lingered. The woman didn't speak to him again, but the damage had already been done. The man was left to reflect on the encounter, unsure of how to process the emotions it had stirred. He was grateful that the flight crew had stepped in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's words had cut deeper than he cared to admit. The plane had been in the air for a while, the hum of the engines now a steady background to the tense atmosphere in the cabin. The man kept his eyes fixed on the window, the swirling clouds below offering no real escape from the storm of emotions inside him. He had thought that by staying quiet, by ignoring the woman beside him, he could get through this. But now, as the flight stretched on, he realized that wasn't the case. The weight of her words, the disdain in her voice lingered like a dark cloud hanging over him. It was hard to shake off. The woman had quieted down for the time being, but the damage had already been done. He could still feel her glare even though she hadn't spoken another word. He could hear the echoes of her insults, each one a little sharper than the last. It was as though she had set her mind on something, and nothing was going to change it. She was determined to make him feel small, to make him feel as though he didn't belong. At this point, the man was beginning to wonder if he could even make it through the rest of the flight without completely losing his patience. Every time he glanced at her, he could see her sitting there, arms crossed, looking out the window as if nothing had happened. But he knew better. He could feel the tension radiating from her. He had seen people like her before, the ones who believed they were entitled to everything, the ones who looked down on others for no other reason than the fact that they thought they were superior. And he had no doubt that in her mind she was winning. For a while he tried to distract himself. He fiddled with his phone, scrolling through messages that didn't interest him, checking the time and then checking it again. But the minutes felt like hours. The woman's earlier words were impossible to ignore. His thoughts raced, trying to figure out why she had singled him out, why she had decided that he was the one she needed to tear down. Was it something about him, or was it something about her? What made her think she had the right to speak to him like that? As the flight continued, he could feel his frustration rising again. He wasn't the type to let things go easily. He didn't like conflict, but he also didn't like being treated unfairly. And this was unfair. He had done nothing to provoke her. All he had done was sit down in his seat just like everyone else. He hadn't asked for her judgment, nor did he need it. Just as he was about to let out a sigh of exasperation, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was the flight attendant, the same one who had intervened earlier. She was standing at the front of the cabin speaking with the captain, but she was also keeping an eye on the woman. The atmosphere had shifted again, and now it seemed like something was about to happen. The attendant's presence made the man feel a little more at ease, knowing that someone was paying attention to the situation. The woman, however, didn't seem to notice the change. She was still staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts, her arms crossed tightly in front of her. It was clear that she wasn't going to let go of whatever anger had built up inside her. The man, on the other hand, just wanted to move on. He didn't want to fight, didn't want to make a scene. He had tried to keep his cool, but it wasn't easy. And then, as if on cue, the woman suddenly turned to him, breaking the silence. "You know," she said, her voice sharper than before, "you're not even worth the trouble." He felt his pulse quicken. He had known this moment was coming, but it still caught him off guard. He didn't respond immediately, letting the silence hang between them for a moment. She was waiting for him to say something, to respond in a way that would give her the satisfaction she was looking for, but he wasn't going to fall for it. He wasn't going to give her that power. Instead, he turned to her slowly, his expression calm but firm. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I'm just here to get to my destination, just like you." The woman scoffed, clearly not satisfied with his response. "That's what they all say," she muttered almost to herself. "But the truth is you don't belong here. You never will." His heart skipped a beat. The words stung, but this time he wasn't going to let her see how much they affected him. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "Everyone belongs where they are," he said softly. "It's not for you to decide who belongs where." The woman stared at him, her eyes narrowing as if she couldn't believe he was standing up to her. For a moment, she didn't speak. The tension between them seemed to escalate, but the rest of the cabin remained silent. It was as though the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next, and then, just when it seemed like the woman was about to say something else, the unexpected happened. The flight attendants, who had been watching the exchange closely, made their move. One of them approached their row, her eyes scanning the situation with a mix of concern and authority. She didn't ask what was going on. She already knew. The way the woman had been speaking, the way the man had been trying to remain calm, it was clear to everyone that something needed to be done. The attendant stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Then, without warning, she turned to the woman and spoke in a tone that left no room for argument. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant said firmly, "but your behavior is no longer acceptable. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane." The woman's face turned red. She opened her mouth to protest, but the attendant held up a hand, silencing her. "We've had multiple complaints from passengers about your conduct," the attendant continued, her voice steady and unyielding. You've made others uncomfortable and you've crossed the line. We can't allow this to continue." For a moment, the woman was speechless. Her eyes darted around the cabin, but it was clear no one was on her side. The passengers around them avoided eye contact, some even looking away quickly. It was as if they were all silently agreeing that the woman had gone too far. Finally, the woman stood up, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She grabbed her bag, muttering under her breath as she turned to leave. The man watched her go, a mix of relief and confusion flooding through him. He hadn't expected this. He had expected the flight to continue on with a little more tension, maybe some uncomfortable glances, but not this. The woman was being escorted off the plane. As she left, the atmosphere in the cabin lightened. The man let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He glanced around, and this time a few passengers gave him reassuring smiles. No words were spoken, but the understanding was there. He wasn't alone in this. The woman had crossed a line, and people had seen it. For the rest of the flight, there was a sense of calm, but the man couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had changed something inside him. He had been forced to confront the ugliness of racism in a way that he hadn't expected, and though he had managed to keep his composure, it had taken a toll. But as the plane neared its destination, he began to realize that this wasn't just a random incident. It was a reminder that people like the woman would always be out there trying to tear others down. But it was also a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself and letting others see you do it could make all the difference. The rest of the flight went by much faster than he had anticipated. After the woman was escorted off the plane, the atmosphere shifted completely. It was as though the cloud of negativity that had hung over the cabin had suddenly lifted, and everything seemed just a little bit lighter. The man could feel the tension melting away as the passengers returned to their usual quiet routines. Some of them went back to their books while others stared at the small screens in front of them, trying to pretend that nothing had happened. But for the man, it was hard to forget. Even though the woman was gone, the sting of her words still lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that her attack on him wasn't just about the flight. It was something bigger. It was about the way people like her saw the world, and the way they saw people like him. The woman hadn't just insulted him because of his clothes or his appearance. She had made assumptions about who he was, what he was worth, and where he belonged, all because of how he looked. That kind of judgment was something he had experienced far too many times before. People who assumed he didn't belong, simply because of his skin color. People who believed that certain spaces were off-limits for someone like him. He had dealt with it in different ways over the years, sometimes ignoring it, sometimes fighting back. But today he realized something important. It wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had ever been made to feel small, to feel less than. It was about the bigger picture, about how the world still had so much work to do in terms of equality and respect. But as he sat there, lost in his thoughts, something unexpected happened. One of the flight attendants, the same one who had intervened earlier, approached his row once more. This time she was smiling. She had a warm, reassuring look on her face, as if she understood what had just transpired and wanted to acknowledge it. "Are you doing all right?" she asked gently. The man looked up, surprised by the question. He hadn't expected anyone to check on him after everything that had happened. He gave her a small nod, trying to hide the exhaustion in his eyes. "I'm okay, just thinking," he replied, his voice steady but tired. The attendant nodded, sensing the weight of what he had been through. "It's hard to imagine the kind of things people have to go through," she said quietly. "But I just want you to know that you handled yourself with a lot of grace today. It's not easy to stay calm in situations like that." He smiled faintly, grateful for her words. "Thanks. It wasn't easy, but I didn't want to let her get the best of me." She smiled back, giving him a sympathetic look. "You did good. A lot of people might have reacted differently, but you kept your composure. Not everyone can do that." Her words meant more to him than she probably realized. He had been questioning himself for most of the flight, wondering if he could have done more, said more to put an end to the woman's hurtful behavior. But hearing her say that made him feel a little bit better about how he had handled the situation. As the flight continued, the man tried to push the incident to the back of his mind. He wasn't going to let it ruin the rest of his day, and he certainly wasn't going to let it define him. He had more important things to focus on. There were bigger challenges ahead, and he wasn't going to let a rude woman on a plane take away his peace of mind. But as the plane began its descent, something else caught his attention. A few rows ahead, he saw some of the passengers who had been sitting near the woman. They were talking quietly among themselves, and he could hear snippets of their conversation. Some of them were talking about how uncomfortable the whole situation had made them feel. Others were discussing how proud they were of the way the man had handled himself. It was a small moment of solidarity, but it made him feel less alone. When the plane landed, the man gathered his things, standing up and stretching his legs as the other passengers slowly began to disembark. But just as he was about to leave, something unexpected happened. One of the passengers who had been sitting near him during the flight approached. The man didn't recognize him at first, but the passenger smiled and extended his hand. "Hey, I just wanted to say that I saw what happened," the man said, his voice kind but firm. "And I just want you to know that I respect the way you handled it." The man was taken aback, not expecting anyone to approach him after everything that had happened. He shook the passenger's hand, surprised but grateful for the support. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I appreciate that. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do." The passenger nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. "I know what it's like to be judged by people who don't know you, and I've seen a lot of people buckle under that kind of pressure. But you didn't. You stood your ground. That takes a lot of strength." The man smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for this stranger who had taken the time to offer support. "It means a lot to hear that. Sometimes it's easy to feel like you're the only one who notices, you know?" The passenger nodded again, his expression softening. "Believe me, you're not alone. And I hope you know that there are people out there who see you for who you really are, not just what people assume you are." The words hit him harder than he expected. It was as though, for a moment, the weight of everything he had gone through in his life, every instance of judgment, every racist comment, every unspoken assumption, had been lifted, if only just for a second. He felt a little lighter, as though this small moment of connection with a stranger had somehow made it all feel worth it. As the passengers continued to exit, the man walked toward the exit gate, feeling a little less burdened than before. The woman was gone, and her words had lost their power over him. The flight had ended, but the experience had taught him something valuable. He had learned that standing up for yourself was important, but so was knowing when to let go. He had learned that, despite the negativity in the world, there were still people who cared, people who saw beyond the surface. The journey didn't end with the plane landing. It continued every day, in every interaction, in every moment when he would face the world and choose to rise above the judgment and hate that sometimes seemed so overwhelming. He walked off the plane with a newfound sense of peace, knowing that, no matter what people said or assumed about him, he had the strength to stand tall, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. As the man walked off the plane, he felt a strange mix of relief and reflection. The flight had been long and exhausting, both physically and emotionally. He had dealt with insults, judgment, and harsh words from a complete stranger, but he had also managed to keep his composure. The woman's cruel words no longer felt as sharp as they had earlier. They had lost their power the moment she had been escorted off the plane. It was a strange kind of victory, one that didn't feel like it had come from an argument or confrontation, but from holding on to his dignity in the face of adversity. He stepped into the airport terminal, the bright lights and bustling crowd a sharp contrast to the silence he'd experienced on the plane. As people rushed past him, some chatting with friends, others lost in their phones, he felt like he had been transported to a different world. The incident on the plane had seemed so big in that moment, but now, in the vastness of the airport, it felt almost distant. His steps slowed as he took in the familiar sights. The long rows of gates, the crowded baggage claim areas, the distant hum of intercom announcements. Everything seemed normal again, yet something inside him had shifted. He had learned something valuable about himself that day. He had always known that people could be cruel, that judgment was a constant companion for those who didn't fit the narrow molds others tried to force upon them. But today, he had faced it head-on, and more importantly, he had not allowed it to change him. He had chosen to remain calm, to hold on to his self-worth, and not let the woman's harsh words define him. He had chosen peace over anger, grace over retaliation, and in the end, that was something to be proud of. As he made his way toward the baggage claim, he couldn't help but replay the conversation he had had with the passenger who had approached him earlier. The man had been so kind, so understanding. It had been a simple exchange, just a few words of support, but it had meant more to him than he could express. In a world where it often felt like people were more likely to turn a blind eye to injustice, the fact that this stranger had stepped forward, spoken up, and acknowledged what had happened, it gave him hope. It reminded him that there were still good people in the world, people who were willing to stand with others even if it was just for a brief moment. The baggage claim area was crowded, and he stood there waiting for his bag to come around. The normalcy of it all, people chatting with each other, pulling their luggage off the conveyor belt, going about their business, felt oddly comforting. He was just another person in the crowd now. He wasn't defined by the woman's words anymore. He was just a man, trying to get home, trying to continue with his life just like everyone else. His suitcase finally appeared, and he grabbed it, turning toward the exit. As he stepped out into the fresh air, the cool breeze hit his face, a welcome change from the dry air of the plane. He breathed in deeply, feeling the weight of the day begin to lift off his shoulders. He had made it through. The flight was over. The woman was gone. And most importantly, he hadn't let her win. He stepped into a taxi, grateful for the quiet solitude it offered. The driver asked him a few routine questions, but he kept his answers short. He didn't feel like talking much. His mind was still processing everything that had happened. He had wanted to forget about the encounter, to move on from it, but something told him that this moment, this experience was important. It was a reminder of the kind of world he lived in and the kind of person he wanted to be. It wasn't about the woman's insults. It was about the choices he made in the face of hate. The taxi ride was short, and soon he was home. He stepped out, grabbed his bag, and headed inside. As he closed the door behind him, the weight of the day seemed to melt away. He kicked off his shoes, stretched out on the couch, and let out a long sigh. It felt good to be home. Later that evening, as he sat down to a quiet dinner, he thought about everything the flight had brought him, everything the woman had made him confront about himself. The encounter wasn't just about racism. It wasn't just about the insults or the harsh words. It was about the way people viewed each other, the assumptions they made based on skin color, clothing, or appearance. But it was also about resilience. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity, not letting hate dictate your life. He had seen this kind of thing before, in different forms. People made assumptions about others all the time, often without even realizing it. Whether it was about a person's background, their education, or their worth, it was easy to look at someone and think you knew everything about them. But he had learned today that appearances could be deceiving. It wasn't the clothes you wore or the way you spoke or the color of your skin that determined your value. It was your character, your actions, how you treated others, how you chose to respond to hate, to judgment, to cruelty. As he finished his meal, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from avoiding conflict or ignoring the ugliness of the world. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing that he had done the right thing. He hadn't let the woman's words break him. He hadn't let her hate change the way he saw himself. He had stood tall in the face of cruelty, and he had walked away with his dignity intact. That night, as he lay in bed, he reflected on the strange journey the day had taken him on. It had started as just another routine flight, and then it had turned into something much deeper. He had been tested, and in the end, he had passed the test. He had proven to himself that he was stronger than the hate others tried to impose on him. He had learned that he didn't have to let people's assumptions or judgments dictate who he was. He could choose his own path. The next morning, he woke up feeling different. The world outside hadn't changed. There was still inequality, still judgment, still racism. But he felt like he had gained something from the experience. He had gained a deeper understanding of the strength it took to stand up against hate, and the quiet power that came from holding on to your truth. As he went about his day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew there would always be challenges, but he also knew he had the tools to handle them. It wasn't about fighting back with anger or bitterness. It was about standing firm, keeping your head high, and knowing that you were worth more than the hurtful things people said. And in that knowledge there was freedom. He wasn't just a passenger on a flight anymore. He was someone who had been tested and had passed. He was someone who had learned that no matter what others said, his worth wasn't up for debate. His worth was already determined by the way he treated others, by the way he treated himself. And as he went about his life, he knew that every encounter, every moment of judgment or prejudice, was an opportunity to stand taller, to be kinder, and to remind the world that hate could never have the last word.